Los Angeles. Evening. The sun's dying rays painted the horizon with warm shades of orange and pink, giving the city that mysterious, almost magical look that so often draws people from all over the world. Inside a train, rolling through the suburbs, sat a young woman named Sarah. Her face was pale, as though drained from years of worry, and her eyes were swollen from long, bitter tears. She clutched an old leather purse in her hands, as though trying to hold on to whatever control she had left over her own life. The purse was nearly worn out, just like Sarah. Her life seemed torn to pieces, with each fragment filled with regret and pain. Sitting next to her was her mother, Emily, a woman just over 40, with a youthful face that still held the traces of the lively, carefree young woman she once was. Now, Emily tried to be a pillar for her daughter, though she could feel her own heart breaking with the weight of helplessness. In her dark eyes there was worry, mixed with exhaustion. She knew she had to support Sarah, but how could she do that when she felt like she was running on empty? "Mom, I don't know what to do," Sarah managed to choke out through her sobs, staring out the window, though she wasn't really seeing anything. Her gaze was lost, just like her soul. "I thought everything was going to be different. I dreamed of being happy, of building my life, but now I don't even know what's happening to me. Everything's falling apart, and I can't stop it." Sarah tried to wipe away the tears, but they kept coming. She felt her world disintegrating, like sand slipping through her fingers. Her dreams, the ones she'd held on to for so long, the ones she believed in, now seemed distant and unreachable, like a mirage. Emily held her daughter tightly, trying to pass on whatever strength she had left, but the words came out weak and hollow. She could feel her heart breaking as she looked at the girl who used to be so full of life and hope. Now Sarah was like a lost soul, wandering through a world that felt foreign and hostile. "We'll get through this, sweetie. You're not alone," Emily said, her voice betraying her own pain. "You know I'm always here for you. I'll always be here until you find your way back." But those words, in that moment of despair, seemed too simple, too ordinary. How do you comfort someone standing on the edge of a cliff? How do you offer solace when everything they've ever known is crumbling? Sarah turned her head back to the window, trying to block out the darkness that was consuming her mind. The city, which had once seemed like a place of new beginnings, now looked foreign, cold, and indifferent. The gray buildings, the empty streets. It was all so far from the world she had dreamed of when she was a child. "He left, Mom," she whispered, as if that one word could lift the weight off her chest. Her voice was barely audible, filled with despair. "He didn't even try to understand. He just left. And now I'm alone, completely alone." Emily felt her daughter's pain cut through her heart. She knew that the man who should have been her support, who should have been there for her in this difficult moment, was gone. The biological father of the child hadn't just failed to be a support for Sarah. He had turned away at the hardest moment, as if he had no part in this whole situation. Sarah closed her eyes again, and the image of that man appeared before her. His confidence, his words, his promises. She had believed that they would be happy. But now those memories had turned into nothing more than a pain she couldn't shake. Inside her, there was a stone, growing heavier with each passing day. The burden was too great to carry alone. She didn't know how to keep living with this. How do you go on when you feel betrayed and abandoned? "You're not alone," Emily said again, but this time her words came with a firmer tone. She could have said anything, but one truth remained. They had to face this together. Sarah's world was falling apart, but this wasn't the end. And if she, as a mother, could help her daughter in this turbulent sea of pain, she would do whatever it took. But how much strength did it take to be the support when everything was crumbling? Emily closed her eyes for a moment, realizing that maybe she herself needed support. Both of them were on the edge, but they both knew that in order to survive, they had to hold on to each other. And maybe this moment of mutual vulnerability, would be the turning point that helped them start rebuilding what was broken. Sarah turned to her mother again, but this time her gaze wasn't as lost. There was something new in it. Not hope, but a desire to fight, even with her eyes closed. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew that in this world, there weren't many things you could hold on to. But one of those things was support, even if it was fragile. A few weeks had passed. Sarah still felt the weight in her chest, like the world she once knew had turned into a dark, endless sea, and she was a small boat drifting on it, without a sail. But despite all the pain and loss, she had made an important decision: to start fresh. Sarah understood that she could no longer live constantly looking back at the moments she could never get back. The pain of loss, the emptiness left by the departure of someone who should have been there, couldn't and shouldn't be her only future. But ahead of her lay fear. The fear that she wouldn't make it, that she couldn't overcome the barriers she had put up for herself. She was afraid of what was to come, afraid that she wouldn't find the strength to start over, that she would end up in the same dead end she'd struggled so hard to escape. But at some point, something inside her changed. She realized she couldn't stay stuck in the past forever. She needed to move forward, even if it was slow and painful, even if she had to drag herself, but she had to keep going. And it was at that moment that Jake appeared in her life, a man who became so much more than just a friend. Jake had always been there, but before she had almost completely lost hope, his presence had been just a background noise, a part of her everyday life. Now, though, he had become something more. He was the one who didn't ask, didn't pry, didn't judge, and didn't offer empty advice. He was just there, and that was enough. His calmness, his belief that everything would be okay, became the lifeline Sarah grabbed onto in the stormy sea of her despair. Jake was the one who helped her get through those dark days when she thought she'd never escape the shadows. He wasn't trying to fix her problems, he wasn't offering quick solutions, he was just there. And there was something more in that than any words could offer. They walked around the city together, talking about the simplest things: books, movies, music, how sometimes life felt unfair, but how it was still worth moving forward. These conversations were light and easy, but in them Sarah began to feel something change inside her. She could laugh again, despite the pain. She could hope again, despite the doubts. It was hard, and sometimes scary, but with each day Sarah felt herself healing, feeling life return to her. A few more weeks passed, and one day, when Sarah still couldn't believe she could ever truly be happy again, Jake proposed. It happened while they were sitting by the ocean, enjoying the stillness. There was a light breeze, but the sound of the waves was calming. Sarah looked at Jake, and in his eyes she saw something that made her heart beat faster. It wasn't just a question, not just a request, but something that spoke of a readiness for change. Not just for her, but for him too. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with a mix of emotions. She couldn't understand why he would choose her, broken and vulnerable as she was. She wasn't the woman he once knew. She wasn't the woman he had dreamed about. She was different, and this new version of Sarah, she thought, wasn't worthy of building a future with him. Without hesitation, Jake looked her in the eyes, his gaze filled with certainty. "I want you, just as you are. I'll be with you until you find your way," he said quietly, but with such conviction that Sarah couldn't help but believe him. There wasn't a hint of pity or regret in his words. He wasn't asking for anything. He was simply offering to be there, to help if she needed it, and to love her despite everything. Sarah was silent, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with too many thoughts. She felt that this proposal wasn't just an act of kindness or gratitude. It was something bigger. It was a chance to believe in herself, a chance to start over. She thought about it for a long time, trying to figure out if she was ready to take that step. Was she ready to allow herself to be loved, despite all her fears and insecurities? But in the moment when she said yes, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just an agreement to Jake's proposal. It was the moment when she finally admitted to herself that she could be strong, that she deserved happiness, that she could dream again about the future. And a month later, when everything seemed to be falling into place, and Sarah began to feel like her life might be headed in the right direction, they got married. It was a small, but very meaningful step. The wedding was simple, without any grandeur and with more humility. But that's exactly what she needed. Sarah didn't long for extravagant ceremonies or loud celebrations. She wanted to feel alive, to feel the support and love she had been searching for so long. As they stood before the altar, Sarah felt Jake's hand holding hers tightly. His fingers were warm, his gaze filled with love and a promise to be there, asking for nothing in return. It was something new, hope that was real, support that required no proof. And despite all her worries and fears, Sarah knew. She had made the right choice. She had finally believed in herself and in the idea that her life still had meaning. Sarah gave birth to a baby girl, Evelyn. The moment little Evelyn was born, everything changed for Sarah. It was a turning point, the moment she first felt that there was something bigger than her own pain and fears. For the first time in her life, she truly felt responsible for someone else, and the love that filled her heart was so strong that it overshadowed everything else. Evelyn was a little miracle, bringing light and warmth into their home, and at that moment, Sarah realized that her life could truly be different. Life began to take on the shape of stability. There were more days when Sarah woke up with a smile, because her little girl filled her heart with unconditional love and laughter. Jake had become not only her husband but also a real father to Evelyn. He cared for her as his own daughter, and Sarah could see how deeply he had bonded with the little girl. He was not just her partner, but also her support during the hardest moments. Together with Evelyn, they had become a real family. And despite the shadows of their past, they began building a future full of hope and love. Every day with Jake and Evelyn was filled with small joys. Laughter, walks in the park, family dinners when they all sat together at the table. These moments seemed simple, but to Sarah, they meant so much more. They were moments of normalcy she had long since lost. She couldn't forget all that she had been through, but now she had a goal, to give her daughter a better world than the one she had known in her own childhood. That was her primary focus. But even in this world of happiness and new beginnings, there was something that weighed on her. Despite her best efforts to forget, there was still one person from her past. The guy, Evelyn's biological father. He disappeared when Sarah was on the edge of despair. He was the one who promised to be there, but when things got tough, he just vanished. His words and promises melted away like smoke, and Sarah was left alone. Now, after all this time, she didn't even know what had become of him. There was no trace, no information, no signs of his presence in their lives. His disappearance left a void in her heart that no one could fill. He was supposed to be the one there during the most important moments. He was supposed to be the one who could have been her support when everything was falling apart. But instead, he became a symbol of betrayal. He was, in essence, the one who didn't want to be part of her life when she needed him the most. During the months when Sarah's life was slowly healing, she tried not to think about him. She tried to drown out the memory of the man who once meant everything to her. Yet, despite all her efforts to forget, he lingered in her mind like a shadow that couldn't be fully chased away. He was part of her past, part of her pain, and despite everything she had been through, he was the one who didn't want to be part of her future. However, as Sarah began to embrace her new life, his absence was seen differently. He was no longer a real person, but just a symbol of what was in the past, of what wasn't, and what might never be. He became a symbol of broken hopes, shattered expectations, and lost time. And while his disappearance still caused pain, Sarah no longer tried to find the answer to the question of why he left. Now, it just didn't matter. She wasn't the woman who felt helpless before him anymore. Sarah had grown. She was a mother now, a wife, and a strong woman who knew how important it was to move forward. She had learned not to look back, not to seek comfort in the past. With each passing day, she became more confident in herself and in her family. Jake was there, supporting her and loving her, and that was enough to look ahead, not back. Sarah understood that the most important thing for her now was to be strong for her daughter. She was ready to be the mother she had always wanted to be. She wanted Evelyn to grow up in a world full of love, care, and stability, so that she would never feel the loneliness that had been so familiar to Sarah in her own childhood. Sometimes in the silence of the night, when Evelyn was asleep and Jake was working, Sarah would still think about that man. But now, in those thoughts, there was no more pain or despair. There was only the understanding that she no longer needed him. She had already found her family, and it was a real family, built with Jake and Evelyn. It was the world where she could be happy, and she was ready to do whatever it took to make that world the best for her daughter. She no longer wanted to live in the past, she wanted to live in the present. And most importantly, she wanted a future full of love and care. Now, what mattered more was what she could offer her daughter, not what the man had left behind. Sarah was ready to move forward, with her new family and a new outlook on life. This was a new stage, a new chapter, and she was ready for it. Years went by quickly. Time had flown, and Sarah and Jake continued to build their life together. Their home was filled with happiness, care, and laughter. They had become a real family, a family that had been through a lot, but despite all the challenges, had managed to hold on to each other. Sarah was happy, and that feeling became the foundation of their relationship, of her role as a mother and wife. Sarah and Jake had a son who became their pride and joy. His arrival was yet another reminder that they could overcome whatever came their way. Evelyn, now a teenager, had become a confident and strong young woman. She had grown up surrounded by love and care, and she was completely different from the girl who once struggled with pain and loneliness. Her life was filled with light, and Sarah was proud of the person she had become. She always felt she had made the right choices, and now, looking at her daughter, she understood that her family was the most precious thing she had ever created. One day, while Sarah and Evelyn were on a train headed to another city, something happened that would change them forever. Sarah, tired from the long journey and lost in her thoughts, suddenly noticed him. He was sitting by the window, in the far corner of the car. His face was familiar, yet somehow distant. He was the man who had once been part of her life, part of everything connected to Evelyn, to her past, to a time Sarah had tried so hard to forget. The man she once loved, who had promised to be there and support her, but had vanished when she needed him the most. The biological father of Evelyn. He sat there, staring out the window, unaware of her presence. But Sarah immediately recognized him. Her heart skipped a beat, but there was no anger or pain in her eyes. Only a strange calm, as if none of this mattered anymore. He was no longer part of her life. He was just a shadow of the past. Sarah looked at her daughter, sitting beside her, and felt how her perception of the moment had changed. She saw the girl she had raised with love and care, the girl who, despite all the difficulties, had grown into a confident, strong young woman. Sarah felt love and pride fill her chest. This wasn't the little girl who had been abandoned, left to fend for herself. This was her daughter, her Evelyn, now grown and strong, with gratitude in her heart for the fact that Sarah had always been there for her. Evelyn noticed that her mother was staring at the man, and she couldn't help but sense that something important was happening between them. The man by the window and her mother. Evelyn knew that this man had been part of her mom's past, part of what she had tried to forget, but that had still left a mark on her life. "Is that him, Mom?" she asked carefully, trying to gauge her mother's reaction. Sarah nodded. There was no fear or anxiety in her eyes, just a calm that she couldn't quite explain. "Yes, that's him," she said softly, almost as if confirming for herself that this man no longer mattered. His presence was just a reminder of what was left behind. Sarah couldn't hold back a faint smile that seemed both sad and thankful. She could feel a quiet, yet firm, inner response echoing inside her. "I made it through. I did it." The train began to slow down as it neared the station. Mother and daughter stood up and headed for the exit. At that moment, Sarah looked back and their eyes met. The man finally saw her, and it seemed like he was trying to understand what was going on. His face was tense, as if he was realizing that he no longer had any place in her life. He was a part of the past that would never return. His gaze was filled with mixed emotions: fear, resentment, disappointment. But Sarah didn't feel any of that anymore. His presence didn't bring pain. It was just a memory. He saw that she had long since found her way, that her life was full of love, and that he was nothing more than a shadow she had long moved past. This realization made him look away. Sarah and Evelyn stepped off the train. A light breeze blew on the platform, and Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the freedom from the past filling her. She looked at her daughter, and in her eyes was pride. It was that moment when you realize that everything you've been through wasn't in vain. A moment when you understand that, despite all the pain and loss, you found your way. And that way was filled with love and happiness. Sarah took Evelyn's hand and they both stepped into a new day, a new world that was all their own. It was filled with hope and light. Now they could move forward, knowing that the future belonged to them. Sarah no longer needed that man. She was happy. She had a family she had dreamed of, a family she had built herself. And it was this family, full of love, care, and support, that was her true home. Now she could move confidently through life, no longer looking back. Ahead of her lay only a bright future. With every step they took together, with every moment she spent with Jake, Sarah felt her heart swell with gratitude for everything she had. And while the moment was brief, it was an important step in her healing process. Sarah understood that there are times in life when you have to leave the past behind and look only to the future. And now, looking at her daughter, she knew everything was going to be okay. In that moment, as she walked with Evelyn down the platform, she was truly free. Free from the past, free from the pain, and ready to give her family the best she could. "It's going to be okay," she whispered to herself, confident in her words. And looking into her daughter's face, Sarah felt the warmth of her heart spill into the world. This day, this moment,